So what's up, hobby friends? In this video, I'm going to be showing you a quick and easy method to painting some fairly generic gray urban bases perfect for a city environment like New York City. So all you're going to need for this is empty base. Doesn't matter if you have a model on top or not. I tend to prefer painting these bases without the model on top, and that way if I'm doing any freehanding for sidewalk markings, street markings, road markings, it's a lot easier to do without a figure on top. But you can easily do this if you have a model already glued on. That's no problem. To do the gray stone, we're using AK Tenebris Gray, Ash Gray, Medium Sea Gray, and Gray Blue. And then to paint any road markings, we're using Pale Gray and Greenish White. If you have any sort of manhole covers or sewer grates, we're going to be painting them in a non-NMM Copper. So we're going to use Scale Colors African Shadow, aka Saddle Brown, Deep Brown, and Scale Colors Tenaire Yellow. We'll also be using some black, just do some blacklining, and then we'll have some Games Workshop Vanilla Hack Oxide for some rust effects. We'll also be applying some weathering powders to this, using a 50-50 mix of Vallejo Pigments Burnt Umber and Burnt Sienna. This is just a sort of earthy brown and sort of an orangey brown, orangey red color. If you use this fairly often, I do recommend creating a pre-mix in a container. This way you can easily go back to it very quickly without having to constantly mix the ratio from these. You'll also need a brush, fine detail brush to paint any markings, as well as the copper, and then some dry brushes to do the base itself. So I've got some fairly cheap makeup brushes here, and then an artist opus brush. But whatever brush you prefer, I would recommend something that's fairly soft and short bristled, so you can get sort of a very rough, very nice texture to the base very quickly. So the first thing that you want to do is determine where the front of the base is, which way the model will be facing, because that's going to dictate where you're placing your highlights and how you're going to be doing your dry brushing, as well as highlighting all of the copper elements, as well as any markings. So for simplicity, I'm just going to designate this as the front of the base. Nice angles of motion. I figure the model will be looking and pointing somewhere this direction or this direction, and I'll have it mounted to the paint holder in such a way that I know that this is the front. Sidewalk in the back, very nice and easy. I'm going to start with my Tenebris Gray mix, or mix my Tenebris Gray color. And I'm just going to very liberally and very quickly dry brush over the entire base. If you're doing a whole bunch of bases at once, you can actually use the airbrush if you want for this and just apply a quick coat. It's more a base coat, less a dry brush. And you want to make sure that you're giving the base sufficient time to dry in between your colors. If you dry brush them while they're wet, you're going to push the paint around the model. It's not going to adhere well because you're pulling paint off of each layer, and it ends up being messier. So I recommend doing these in batches, or get a hair dryer and just hair dry each layer before moving on to the next color. You'll also want to make sure that your dry brush is dry when you're jumping from color to color. So either have multiple dry brushes on hand just to quickly move through them, or make sure that you're very, very rough in terms of how you're drying the brush on your paper. You don't want to have any moisture or any water in this when you move from color to color. Once the Tenebris Gray is dry, we're going to go straight into our next color, our Ash Gray. And we're going to be dry brushing this in sort of a swirl or circular motion, starting with the front of the base. And we're going to work our way back, and we're just going to gently begin to fade our color. You want to create some shadowing, particularly in the back of the base and then where the sidewalk meets the pavement. And how much or how little of the Tenebris Gray you leave showing is up to you, depending on how dark or bright you want the base to end up. Once that's dry, we go into our medium sea gray. We do the exact same thing, only with a much lighter touch, focusing on the front. Now I'm still moving in a circular motion, but what I'm doing is I'm going across the entire base now. And I'm trying to keep my touch light, really focusing in, highlighting on the front. And then finally, once we're done that drybrushing stage, we're going to take our gray blue, which is, funny enough, almost a value step down. But because we're working in a dry brush motion, building up on what we already have here, it's going to inherit some of the value properties of the colors underneath. So even though this gray blue is a touch darker than our medium sea gray, that's okay, because what we're looking to do is start to tint it towards that blue color. Keep it nice and light, and we're going to be focusing this over the entire base. And depending on how heavy or light you go with this gray blue, you start to get some cool interactions with the different colors, the more neutral gray underneath with the gray blue on top. It makes the gray a little less boring, a little bit more colorful. And what I'm doing now is I'm also stippling or dotting with this dry brush, just to create a little bit of extra texture on the base. Getting some of that wet color on there, that wet paint, to get pure spots of that gray blue. And this will be important later on when we start to add our road pathway markings. When we start to add some of that weathering on there, we're going to be using the same stippling technique as well. So it helps already have some spots of that flat blue color. So once we're done dry brushing the gray and blue, we want to black line in preparation for our next steps. So we're going to take our Tenebris gray, dilute it just a little bit so it's almost like a watercolor mix, and we're just going to gently paint into the pathway lines here, or stone lines. And you can use an oil paint for this. You can use a wash. Any color will work, really. I want to use something that I've already used on this base already without being too stark. So I want to avoid using anything black. Once we apply our weathering powders, it's going to knock back a lot of this contrast too. So should we get the sidewalk? And then for the sewer grate, we're going to take black, And we want to make sure that we paint into all of the gaps, as well as around the edge. Don't worry about the tops because we can basically put that with our copper colors later. There's no need to. As long as we have the inside of the sewer grate black along with the edges, we want to make sure that once we are able to paint the top with just our copper colors, we don't have to worry about going back in and blacklining the sewer grate itself. So to paint the any sort of sidewalk or road markings, we're going to be using those two colors, pale gray and our greenish white. We're going to start with pale gray first and get a nice even base coat, really sort of block in whatever patterns or markings that we're thinking of. So I'm going to go and paint a white line here, or a gray line rather, for the sidewalk edge marking. And you want to be careful not to get any sort of gray or color into the cracks. And you can play around with the width and the proportion or the exact details of what you want. Maybe I'll dot some of it in the pattern here so it's broken off because of the rubble. But for something like this, because of the height of the actual sidewalk itself, you want to make sure that you're balancing the width of this to match the height of this. And I like to go very similar in terms of matching the width to the height, almost so it's like a 1-to-1 proportion. Maybe just a little narrower on top compared to the height. And you can really have fun with the kinds of markings that you want to do. Let's say, for example, in this base, I want to put school. All right, very straightforward. So we're going to start with marking down the S, and I'm just going to go ahead and freehand this. This is something that you can use a stencil for. You can use masking tape or what have you. Whatever you're comfortable with, whatever you prefer to use. I'm pretty old school, so. And because I've done this often enough, I can kind of know how to, or where I want to put the marking just in terms of proportions, how the letter is shaped. And then once you have the basic sort of structure or the shape of the marking or the lettering that you want to do, we can then begin to tweak the edges, sharpen up any corners, and we do this via a method called erasing. Now, it can be a little trickier on a base like this where you have a bunch of sort of freehand patterns behind, but this is sort of where that dry brushing stippling technique comes into play, is we're now able to start taking some of our previous mixes, so our ash gray, medium gray, gray blue, and we can just roughly play around with the exact values to paint back and correct some of these lines. And as long as you're approximate, it doesn't have to match the value or the colors around it precisely. Let's see, blue. If the color is off, just stipple it around a little bit and sort of create a pattern around, and that'll help you to fix the letter. And we'll just continue to proceed to paint the rest of our school, which I think we're only going to get the CH in that bit of an O. And once we have the gray sort of skeleton or structure of our freehand marked in, we can now begin to highlight it. So what we're going to do is start mixing in just progressive amounts of greenish white, remembering where the front of our base is, and then we'll just highlight in our freehand. And all we're doing is we're just adding progressive amounts of our greenish white until our final highlight is pure greenish white. Make sure not to neglect the side of the sidewalk as well. And we'll make sure we do the same thing to the lettering. And because this is at the back of the base, we don't need to take it as bright as here because the front is here. We're actually going to get fairly dark into the back of the S. So this will be a fairly quick and easy highlight job. If the letters are closer to the front, you'll want to highlight the letters a little bit more. What I'm also doing with this highlighting, especially on the letter, is I'm half painting normally, half stippling my brush, just to continue to imply that texture, both from the unevenness of the paint as well as the sidewalk or the roadway. Once again, erasing to correct as necessary. And once that's painted and highlighted, we're going to go back in with our final step. I have tweezers and a sponge that you get from any sort of old blister pack or whatever. You just want the sponge to be a little bit stiff and then torn so that the end is not quite even. It has a bit of a texture to it. And what we're going to do is we're going to lightly stipple to create this sort of random weathering scratchy pattern. So get most of the paint off of the sponge, test the pattern on a piece of paper or your palette. And then we're just going to lightly dab onto certain parts of the lettering, as well as the edge of the sidewalk. Particularly when you get to the edge of the sidewalk, or if there's a walkway or a pathway, think about how the wear and tear is actually happening. Are these people walking and dragging their feet? What's the typical motion for how this wear is happening? And then apply accordingly. Don't need too much. You don't want to ruin the overall shape or patterning of the freehand, just enough to imply that wear to the surface. And if you want to add some more precise dots and scratches, go back in by hand, and you can tweak either with the blue, or if you find that some of your blue is a little too heavy, go back in with your pale gray and your greenish white, or a mix in between, and just correct. To paint the non-metal copper, we're going to start with our base coat of African Shadow, and we're just going to paint it over the entire top of the sewer grate. You want to make sure that you get a nice even base coat. And then from there, our first two highlights of that saddle brown and deep brown, front to back, is essentially just a quick blend. We're going to start with that saddle brown, remembering where our front of the base is. So our light source is coming from this direction. And I'll have a strong highlight to the front of the sewer grate. And then I'm actually going to put a softer one on the back for some reflections from the sidewalk itself. And I'll do the same thing with the deep brown. One thing I want to note as well when we're talking about lighting and shadowing, think about the model that's going on the space. Think about how much space it takes up, and if the model itself creates some additional shadows, you may want to adjust your values depending on how much space the model ends up taking up on the base. And from deep brown, we're just going to take progressive amounts of Tenerial to mix it in and create our highlights. And as we highlight, we're just going to highlight less and less and less of the sewer grate until what we have is just a pure Tenerial highlight on the very frontmost edge. And I'm moving fairly quickly on this base. The paint is still a little wet. And what that's allowing me to do is do a little bit of wet blending with the colors to help create some smoother transitions. Now, when you get about halfway, just in terms of the mix between the two, take the time to do an edge highlight over every corner and every edge. And this way we're handling some of those reflections from surrounding environment, objects and shapes. even on the inside of the sewer grate, I imagine all of the edges are creating highlights that sort of feed into each other and bounce off each other. So we're going to see highlights on both ends, I think. And then once we're at pure tenor yellow, we're going to put a highlight on the frontmost edges. Put one right here. And then we want to put one on the inner edge of the side that's facing towards our light source. So our light's here, which means we're going to capture a highlight in the curve. And then lastly, we're going to finish up with some rust and oxidation effects using Nelahite oxide. Now, this is particularly useful for doing things like manhole covers where you have a larger flat surface area. But on something like this, even in these darker sides, on these little flat edges, you can put some dots of this rust color. And I think it looks really, really good. Keep in mind that this color is fairly diluted, fairly translucent out of the bottle. And so when it dries, it's going to be very subtle. And you may find that you have to do 2 or 3 passes of the color on a particular spot to really ramp up the strength, the saturation of the color. I also find that this color works best on some of the darker spots of this color recipe. It doesn't look quite as poppy on some of these brighter spots. The color gets kind of lost. So I tend to try and keep this rusting in the mid and shadow tones. Another layer of detail that we can add to this base before finishing up with weathering powders is to actually add some sort of posters and newspaper debris. So this is just a graphic that's printed onto a standard A4 printer paper. I have a PDF sort of sheet or template with a whole bunch of these, and I'll make sure that I drop a link down below where you can access them. But really all you do is go to a print shop, or if you have a color printer that's high quality enough, print these out and then cut up a bunch of them and keep them on hand to have for bases. So I'm going to use this and a pair of tweezers to help apply it. I have an old brush, and then to actually glue this on the base, we're going to be using a combination of Mod Podge and water. So Mod Podge is basically sort of a PVA glue thing. I'm using Mod Podge Matte. It's water-based glue, sealer, and finisher. What I like about Mod Podge, unlike PVA glue, is that it dries much clearer, much thinner, without the yellow residue. I think it's just a better product overall. It can be a little harder to find. You have to go specifically to an arts and crafts store. You can't just find them at your typical office supply store, but I think it's a good investment to have. I have this 4-liter jug that I bought probably 4 or 5 years ago. I use it quite often, and I've barely gotten through a quarter of it, so a little bit will last you a long time. I do have a bit of it in this little jar just for easy, quick access. So the first thing we want to do is figure out where we want to put this poster and how we want to orient it. We can have it on the front, on the side. You want to think about the balance of the base and sort of where the model's going to sit, how busy the model's going to look, and that will also impact the size of the particular piece of paper that you want to glue onto the base. So I think I want to have it like this with a bit of fold up on the edge of the sidewalk here. And then I'm going to pre-fold it a little bit to get some more of a natural lining to it. So just to play around. I think something like that's pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're just going to dip it in water very quickly. And then wick off the excess with a finger, paper towel, brush, whatever. You want just enough to soak the paper and help it to form. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put some Mod Podge with a brush. And we're just going to apply it to the back of this. And then we will fold it into place. You want to be careful at this stage not to tear on the paper because it is now wet. It is a little fragile, and too much pulling or pushing and tearing can pull a lot of the graphics. Enough, a little bit of it can actually give it a nice sort of more weathered form to it. Too much though, and you just end up ruining and destroying the piece of paper. Once we have this in position, we want to coat the top of this with some Mod Podge, and this will act as a bit of a glossing to seal the paper and protect it from all the moisture and stuff that we're going to put on top with our weathering powders, mineral spirits, and then our varnish. And this is almost basically like a paper mache if you ever did arts and crafts as a kid. Depending on how the paper has been folded, how large of a surface area, you may find that you have to do a couple of coats of Mod Podge to properly seal and protect. And we'll set that aside to dry. Mod Podge doesn't take too long, maybe 10, 15 minutes. So we'll get it a little cleaned up, let that dry, and then we'll come back with some weathering powders. So once the Mod Podge is dry, we can finish up with the last two steps of the base. We're going to apply some weathering powders. Once again, we have that 50-50 mix of burnt umber and burnt sienna. And what we're going to do is we're just going to do a light application over the base. We're going to be focusing on areas like where the sidewalk meets the pavement, as well as these cracks here where the dust would naturally collect. I will also apply a little bit to the newspaper, enough to make it not feel fresh, like it's been sort of blowing around and sitting there for a while. We'll add some to the back of the base here. Just add a bit of that sort of red-brown color to the spool lettering. Give it a little bit more warmth. And how much or how little you apply is entirely up to you based on how sort of clean or how weathered you want the bases to look. If you're doing this with the model attached, I would recommend that you save this weathering powder step for the very, very end. That way you can get some of that onto the model's feet and help to situate the model in the environment. If you're doing this base like now separately without the model attached, once you've painted the model and everything's all done, go back in with a little bit of extra weathering powder and apply some to the feet of the model again to help situate them into the environment. You also want to make sure that you apply this before cleaning up the base trim. This way you don't have to do it twice. You can be as messy as you want at this stage, and then once everything's all dried and varnished, go back in and paint the base trim black. So once we're happy with the application, we're happy with the effect, we're going to apply some mineral spirits. I have this loaded into a spritzer bottle. And we're just going to liberally coat the base and let it sit for about 45 minutes to an hour to fully evaporate. And what this will do is this will help to fix the mineral, or it'll help fix the weathering powders to the base on top of whatever varnish we apply, and it'll just add that extra layer of protection for what is a tabletop or gaming piece. And once the mineral spirits has fully evaporated and set, you can see the powders are basically fixed in place, and it's more or less how we applied it. Maybe a little bit muted, so if you want it to be a little heavier, make sure that you go heavy with the initial application. The mineral spirits will knock it back a little bit, and then we can just finish up by black lining or painting the trim of the base in black. In situations where you have, for example, this newspaper hanging over the edge just a little bit, make sure that you're careful with the black lining not to paint over the newspaper. And that's pretty much it. The base is done. We can paint the model, affix to the top, and then apply a varnish of choice to seal the entire thing. You want to make sure that your paint is fairly diluted, not so much that it's watery or like a glaze, but enough that you can apply a smooth coat without any sort of paint chunking. If anything, you want to apply a couple of passes of the black paint to ensure a nice smooth finish and to avoid having brush strokes visible in the finished product. And that's all there is to it. These are very simple and effective urban bases, very simple techniques, and you can change up the colors to take the same techniques and redesign the base colors to better suit your collection. So if you enjoyed the video, if you did, make sure you leave a like and follow for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll be sure to have links in the video description below. And as always, until next time, happy hobbying.